Andy Conver here from Echo Paddles. I get a lot of people ask me about just simple care and maintenance they can do on their paddles rather than having to send it to me and pay a lot of money for shipping. I'm going to show you a few simple things that you can do just to put your paddle away for the winter. Your paddle's going to last a good long time, and there's a lot of them out there from 1998 and 99 which come back and they're still in the river, which is pretty amazing. But they do require some care and maintenance each year, particularly keeping that wood sealed up. So what I'm going to show you in this video is looking at the tip of your whitewater paddle to make sure that it's in good shape, and then simply sanding your paddle down, cleaning it, and putting a few coats of varnish on so you can put it away for the winter so that it's ready to go when you pick it out in the spring.
So here I'm showing you a rasp, or just basically a file. It's got a flat side and a round side. And I always want to try and use the round side, especially when I'm doing the tips here, because the flat side is going to dig in on the edges. So the round side gives you better control. So I'm just pushing and moving the rasp at the same time. And what I'm trying to do here is take back the fiberglass off the edge of the tip. And you want to have the aluminum as the leading edge of the tip. So when you hit a rock or something, it's going to be the aluminum that hits it and not the fiberglass, because the fiberglass will just peel back off and nothing's going to hold that glass on again if you do hit a rock. So now we'll take a look at the wood in the paddle. And what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to find cracks, anything that we might have missed just by glancing at it. So I'm pushing on the wood, particularly looking at the tip that takes a lot of abuse. So looking at any of the laminates to see if anything's come apart. Flip it over, have another look, the other side, do the same thing, flex the paddle, see if there's any hairline cracks that you've missed that might need glued before we do any sanding or varnishing. So we'll move on to some sanding. Here's some sandpaper that I'm showing you here, and on the back of all the sandpaper you'll see a number. There's 320, 220. Either will work, it's just fine for refinishing your paddle. I'm going to use a 320 today. It gives a little bit of a finer sanding job. I like to fold it in half. I use a quarter sheet and fold it in half. And then I'm always working up and down with the grain of the paddle, never going across the grain, because you're going to put lines in that you're going to see later. So always going with the grain, doing the edges, doing the blade, working up and down. And I'm not trying to sand very hard here. I'm not trying to go through the finish. Just giving a light scuff, taking off any sort of nicks or dust or debris or anything that's got in there, and just giving it a bit of a tooth for the new coat of varnish that's going to go on. Next we'll just use a clean cotton cloth to wipe down all the dust that's created from the sanding, so just wiping the whole paddle down, getting it ready for the varnish. Here again I'm sanding the T-grip of a whitewater paddle using 320. I like to use something really high number sandpaper here to get a really nice smooth finish on the grip. It's where you're holding the paddle. So again, going with the grain of the grip itself and just sanding it, giving a light sanding so that it's nice and smooth and ready to go. Once again, take the rag, clean rag, and clean it off. Get all the dust off and it's going to be ready for oil. So here's a tack cloth, and this just does a second cleaning, gets everything, any of the little dust particles are going to get picked up by this. It's a sort of a resin soaked rag is what it is. Now I'm going to use the tack cloth on the T-grip. I'm also going to use it on the other flat water paddle that I've sanded and cleaned with the cotton cloth. Now we're going over it once again with the tack cloth, sorry. Just taking any little fine bits of dust off, making sure it's a real clean paddle before we add the coat of varnish. This is a can of tung oil. It doesn't really matter which brand you use, but I like to use tung oil on the T-grips because it gives you a better feel in the hand than a plastically varnished T-grip. So just put some on a rag, wipe it onto the T-grip, putting on a fairly thin coat, and you can build up successive coats by adding a coat pretty much each day for 3 or 4 days, buffing it with your hand and trying to build up a little bit of heat generating to drive the oil into the wood of the grip, and it gives it a really nice feel. So this is a spar varnish. I like to use a clear gloss on them, and I'll apply it with a foam brush. It's a pretty forgiving tool, very easy to use. So once you get your varnish open. You don't want to do a very thick coat. You want to build up pretty thin coats. So avoid having a really goopy brush. So wipe off the excess. I usually start up at the top of the grip and do the grip first. I don't know why, it's a bit of a habit, but I like to make sure that's all covered. And then I can work down and do the blade and the shaft as I continue on. So here I'm doing the top of the grip, a cross pattern, but I'm doing the sides of the grip again with the grain. I'm trying to do everything pretty much with the grain of the wood. So any streaking that you might get, you don't really notice. Now we'll move on to just furnishing the blade. So I'm going to start on the edges. I'll work all the way around the tip. The other edge. And that way, when I do the blade, if there's any drips that come off the edge, I can pick them up. So now I'll work the face of the blade, doing some long strokes, working always trying to go from a wet edge to a wet edge. Trying to put on a thin coat again, working the entire blade. Now we'll move up and work the shaft, holding it a little ways up. I'm working all the way around the shaft. Because it's round, you want to spin it and make sure you get all the areas. Again, holding it against the light to see that you haven't missed any spots. Now I'll move up, and I'm just going to hold it with my thumb and my finger up in an area where I varnished on the grip, and I'll brush those out later. But this allows me to finish up the rest of the shaft. So again, working long strokes up and down the shaft, turning it in my hand a little bit so I can do the sides. Looking around it. Now when it's done, I'm just going to put it in a hanging rack here and brush out the places where I was holding it. Now, you may not have a hanging rack in your garage, but you can use a couple nails or screws. And if you don't, then a simple solution would be just putting it on a piece of wood. So the tip just sits on a piece of wood, and then leaning it against a bench or a table or a shelf here. And I'm just going to angle it out enough so that the only thing touching the shelf is one little spot on the shaft, so that if I turn it over and resand it next time, then there's just one spot there going to be touching, and I'll turn it over in the next coat and it'll be a different spot that's going to touch. Brushing out where I was holding it, and again I'll just spin it around and there'll be one little point on the other side and you won't really notice it. So that's it. Your paddle's going to have a few coats on and ready to go for the spring.